10 years after I quietly stepped back from the company, I co-founded my ex-business partner, stood up at our college reunion, raised a glass, and told 40 former classmates that he'd built the whole thing alone from a dorm room with nothing but hustle and a laptop. He never once said my name, not even in passing. Not even the polite footnote version people usually manage for an old co-founder they've drifted from. What he didn't know, standing there soaking up applause from people who used to know better, who used to watch us pitch that same shaky idea in that same room a decade earlier, was that the paperwork sitting in a locked drawer at my house, the same paperwork his own legal team apparently never bothered to double-check in a decade, still made me the majority shareholder of the company he was bragging about, and that the acquisition deal he'd been quietly chasing for 8 months couldn't close without my signature. If you've ever watched someone rewrite your contribution out of a story you helped build from the very beginning, stay with me because this one took 10 years to fully pay off, and I promise the wait was worth it. My name is Maya. Trevor and I co-founded a software company leisurely together in a dorm room during our senior year of college, and for the first 4 years we built it side by side as true partners before life, and quiet, gradual erasure slowly pulled the story apart into 2 very different versions of the same decade. Ledgerly started as a simple accounting tool for small freelancers, something Trevor and I built together during late nights in the campus computer lab, splitting the work exactly down the middle. He handled engineering, I handled everything else, finance, early sales, and eventually the legal structure of the company itself. Since I'd taken enough business law electives to understand what most 22-year-old founders never bother learning until it's too late, back when we were still surviving on instant noodles and the occasional celebratory pizza whenever we landed a new customer. When we incorporated, I insisted over Trevor's mild objection that it felt overly cautious on a dual-class share structure that gave founding shareholders enhanced voting rights, tied to the original allocation protection against exactly the kind of dilution I'd watched happen to a friend's startup the year before, where a charismatic co-founder had slowly maneuvered his quieter partner out of the company entirely within 18 months. Trevor signed off on it without much scrutiny at the time, more focused on the product than the paperwork, trusting me to handle the parts of the business he found tedious, joking once that I was the responsible one, so he didn't have to be. For the first 4 years, Ledgerly grew steadily, nothing explosive but a loyal customer base. Modest profitability. The kind of slow-burn success that doesn't make headlines but does make payroll. Trevor and I split ownership 51-49 in my favor, a structure we'd agreed to early on, partly because I'd contributed the initial seed capital from a small inheritance, and partly because Trevor, generous in that particular season of our partnership, said he trusted me to hold the tie-breaking vote if we ever disagreed on something major. We shook hands on it over cheap pizza in our shared apartment, both of us more excited about the product than the percentages, neither of us imagining at the time how much that single percentage point would eventually matter, or how differently we'd each come to remember the spirit behind it. One detail I noticed quietly over those early years. Trevor had a habit increasingly, as the company grew, of describing Ledgerly in interviews and pitch conversations as something he'd built using I far more often than we, even when I was standing right beside him, microphone practically passing between us. I mentioned it once gently over coffee after a particularly grating podcast appearance, and he apologized, said it was just a verbal habit from talking to so many investors solo. I believed him mostly because the alternative felt like an unnecessarily suspicious read on someone I trusted completely, someone I'd built something real with from nothing. The shift began during my mother's cancer diagnosis 5 years into the company, when I stepped back from day-to-day operations for what I assumed, and what Trevor and I explicitly discussed, would be a temporary leave of absence while I helped manage her care. "Take whatever time you need," Trevor told me in what felt at the time like genuine generosity, sitting across from me in our small shared office the week I told him about the diagnosis, reaching across the desk to squeeze my hand in a gesture that felt at the time like real friendship, rather than the opening move of a decade-long negotiation. "I've got this covered. We'll figure out your role again once things settle." I believed him completely grateful to have a partner I trusted enough to lean on during the hardest year of my life, relieved that at least one enormous piece of my life didn't need to be a source of stress during a season that already held more than enough of it. During those 8 months, Trevor ran the company largely alone, made dozens of operational decisions I wasn't consulted on, and began gradually referring to himself publicly as Ledgerly's founder, in the singular dropping my name from press mentions, investor updates, and eventually the company's own About Page A change. I only noticed months later when a former classmate mentioned reading about Trevor's solo journey building Ledgerly in a startup blog, sending me the link with a casual, "Hey, isn't this you guys?" that he clearly assumed would be pleasant news rather than the first crack in something I hadn't yet realized was breaking. I remember reading that article twice, sitting in a hospital waiting room waiting for my mother's scan results, feeling a strange, quiet grief layered on top of an already exhausting day. When I raised it with him once things had settled and my mother was in remission, he said, "I didn't mean anything by it. It's just easier to have one clean founder story for press purposes. You know how investors like simplicity." I told him it didn't feel simple to me. He said he'd be more careful going forward, a promise that, in hindsight, he kept about as loosely as most promises made to smooth over an uncomfortable conversation rather than actually change anything. About 6 months later, at a company all-hands I did attend, Trevor introduced a new VP of product by saying, "This is someone who really understands what it took to build Ledgerly from nothing the way I did." I sat in that room, one of the 2 original founders, and heard my own origin story quietly excluded from its own retelling in front of employees I'd personally hired, some of whom glanced my way afterward with the particular uncomfortable expression of people who knew the real story, but didn't feel it was their place to correct their CEO in front of a room full of new hires who only knew the version Trevor had been telling for months. Around this time, Trevor also began suggesting with increasing frequency that my role should shift towards something less central, advisory part-time, a title change to something quieter than co-founder. "You've got so much on your plate with your mom," he said in a tone that sounded like concern but functioned in practice, like a demotion delivered gently enough that objecting felt almost rude, wrapped in the kind of caring language that made pushing back feel like I'd be the one acting ungrateful. I agreed to reduce my day-to-day involvement, partly because it was true I had less bandwidth, and partly because I still trusted on some level that our original agreement, the one Trevor had barely read, the one I'd drafted specifically to prevent this exact situation, still stood whether or not he remembered its details. A year after that, Trevor mentioned casually over a rare lunch that he'd been cleaning up the cap table with a lawyer mentioning something vague about simplifying legacy structures from our founding days. I asked him directly whether that meant changing the ownership split. He said, "Nothing's final, just exploring options. Don't worry about it," in a tone that made clear he expected me not to worry about it rather than actually inviting me into the conversation. I remember watching him say it, noticing how easily the phrase slid out, as if he'd rehearsed it for exactly this kind of question. The same practiced ease he used with investors when he wanted a conversation to end without further scrutiny. I never signed anything. I want to be clear about that. Whatever cleaning up Trevor believed had happened legally on paper, nothing had changed. My 51% remained exactly where I'd structured it, untouched in a drawer he apparently never opened again. At a mutual friend's wedding about 2 years before the reunion, someone asked Trevor casually over cocktails whether he still worked with his old college co-founder. Trevor paused for a beat too long before saying, "It's more my company these days, but yeah, Maya helped in the early days." Helped. I stood 3 feet away holding a glass of champagne, close enough to hear every word, and said nothing, filing the word away with everything else, watching the person who'd asked nod politely and move on to another topic, never knowing they'd just witnessed a decade of careful erasure condensed into a single dismissive sentence. If you'd built something with someone who slowly started erasing your name from its own story, would you have fought to correct the record immediately, or waited the way I did for the moment the truth would matter most? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I still think about whether 10 years of silence was patience or just avoidance wearing a more flattering name. Over the following years, I stepped back further, focusing on caregiving, then eventually a quieter consulting career, watching Ledgerly's growth from a distance through occasional mutual friends and the company's public updates. Trevor never formally bought out my shares. No paperwork ever crossed my desk requesting my signature on anything ownership-related, which struck me each time I thought about it as either remarkably sloppy legal practice on his part or a quiet assumption on his that our original agreement had simply informally stopped mattering. I built a modest, satisfying consulting practice of my own during those years, helping smaller founders structure their companies properly from the start, an irony I didn't fully appreciate until much later, teaching other people to protect themselves the exact way I'd protected myself a decade earlier, sitting across from wide-eyed 23-year-olds who reminded me more than I usually admitted out loud of exactly who Trevor and I used to be. About 8 months before the reunion, I heard through a mutual friend that Trevor had been in advanced talks to sell Ledgerly to a larger fintech company, a deal reportedly valued north of $30 million. I felt hearing it a strange mixture of pride and something harder to name pride in what we'd built together, and a quiet, growing certainty that this particular deal was about to run directly into a wall Trevor didn't know existed. I remember sitting with that news for several days, turning it over, deciding deliberately not to reach out and warn him. Not out of spite exactly, but because some part of me had waited a long time to see whether the truth would surface on its own, the way it eventually always does when paperwork is involved without me needing to force the issue myself. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. I simply waited the same patient instinct that had once made me insist on careful paperwork in a dorm room a decade earlier, trusting that eventually, someone on the acquiring company's legal team would run a proper cap table review, and that when they did, they'd find exactly what I'd protected all those years ago, sitting quietly, waiting for exactly this moment. 3 weeks before the reunion, I received an unexpected email from a corporate attorney representing the acquiring company, requesting a call to clarify historical shareholder records ahead of finalizing due diligence. The email itself was carefully neutral professional, giving nothing away, though I understood immediately reading it twice at my kitchen table exactly what kind of discrepancy must have surfaced in their review. On that call, the attorney explained with careful neutrality that Ledgerly's cap table listed me as holding 51% of voting shares, a detail that according to their records appeared never to have been formally amended, despite what Trevor's team had apparently represented to them informally during earlier deal discussions. She asked whether I intended to support the transaction and whether I'd been aware of my current ownership position. A question she asked I noticed with the particular carefulness of someone who suspected the answer might complicate everything her client had assumed was settled. I've always been aware of it, I told her honestly. I haven't decided yet whether I intend to support the deal as currently structured. I'd like to understand the full terms before I do. I could hear her pause slightly on the other end, recalibrating the sound of a professional quietly recognizing that a straightforward deal had just become significantly less straightforward. She thanked me, said she'd follow up with formal documentation, and mentioned almost as an aside that Trevor's team seemed to have proceeded under the assumption that this wouldn't be an issue. Language she used carefully, clearly aware she was walking a professional line by saying even that much, the kind of controlled understatement lawyers use when they already suspect the real conversation is about to happen somewhere else entirely. I hung up the phone and sat with that sentence for a long time, understanding for the first time in 10 years exactly how much leverage I'd been quietly holding without ever once needing to use it. The reunion happened 2.5 weeks later, in the same banquet hall where Trevor and I had once pitched an early, clumsy version of Ledgerly to a room of unimpressed classmates a decade earlier, back when the company was nothing more than a shaky slide deck and 2 nervous 22-year-olds who genuinely had no idea whether anyone in that room would ever take their idea seriously. Trevor found me near the bar before his toast, warm and easy in the way he'd always been able to turn on for a room. "Maya, it's been forever. You look great. You still doing the consulting thing?" Something like that I said, watching him scan the room the way successful people sometimes do, half present in any single conversation. A few minutes later, glass raised, standing at the front of the same banquet hall, Trevor addressed the room. 10 years ago, I sat in a dorm room with nothing but a laptop and an idea, and I built something real. Ledgerly wasn't handed to me. I built it brick by brick alone, and I'm proud every single day of what that hustle turned into. The room applauded, glasses lifting a few enthusiastic whoops from people who clearly had no idea there was anything to question in the story they'd just heard. Several old classmates glanced toward me, some visibly uncomfortable remembering the way people do a version of the story that included my name, whispering quietly to each other in the particular way people do when they've noticed an omission too glaring to ignore but too awkward to correct out loud. After the toast, I found him near the exit, drink in hand, still glowing from the applause, accepting congratulations from a small cluster of admirers. "Congratulations on the acquisition talks," I said once we had a moment alone. "I hear it's close to closing." "How do you know about that?" he asked, glancing quickly toward the small cluster of old classmates still lingering near the bar, aware suddenly of who might be listening. "Their legal team called me 3 weeks ago," I said. "About the cap table. About my 51%. Trevor's face went through several visible stages in the space of about 4 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and then something closer to genuine alarm. "That's not, we cleaned that up years ago. I told you we were simplifying the structure. You told me you were exploring options," I said. "I never signed anything, Trevor. I still have the original founding agreement. I've had it in a drawer for 10 years exactly where I put it, because nobody ever asked me to sign anything different." "This can't be right," he said, pulling out his phone as if he could resolve it through a text to his lawyer standing in a banquet hall, thumb hovering over the screen without actually typing anything. "My team has been telling the acquirer's counsel this was settled. I need to call someone right now." "Your team told them wrong," I said. "Or you told your team wrong. Either way, the deal doesn't close without my signature, and I haven't decided yet whether I'm giving it." I said it evenly, the way I'd learned to deliver difficult news to founders in my own consulting work, calm enough that the words carried more weight than volume ever could. For a moment, something genuinely cracked in Trevor's face. Real fear, unmistakable, the look of a man realizing the story he'd just told an entire room, the one where he built everything alone, was about to collide publicly, and immediately with a legal reality he'd apparently never bothered to verify, not once in 10 years of telling that same clean version to investors, journalists, and now an entire reunion hall of people who used to know better. His hand still holding his phone was shaking slightly, and for just a second he looked less like the confident founder from the toast and more like the same nervous 22-year-old who'd once pitched a shaky slide deck in this exact room, unsure whether anyone would believe in what we'd built. "Maya, I'm sorry," he said quickly, voice dropping lower, aware suddenly of who might overhear. "I should have handled the paperwork properly years ago. I got busy. I assumed He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair, the same nervous gesture I remembered from every late-night crunch we'd ever pulled together in our shared apartment. "You assumed I'd disappear quietly? I said the same way you assumed you could tell a room full of people I helped teach how to code that you built this alone." "That's not fair." He said something defensive, creeping back into his voice even through the panic. "I've run this company for the last 5 years almost entirely by myself, Maya. You weren't there for the day-to-day. I wasn't there because you told me to take the time I needed and then quietly rewrote what that time meant. While I was taking care of my mother," I said. "Those are 2 very different stories, and only one of them happens to be true." Then almost immediately I watched him reach for something closer to negotiation than apology. "Okay, but we can fix this fast. Whatever percentage you want on the deal, whatever title, I'll make it work. This doesn't have to blow up the acquisition." His voice had already shifted from panic into something more familiar, the smooth, solution-oriented tone he used in every investor meeting I'd ever sat through with him. "I'm not trying to blow up the acquisition," I said. "I'm trying to make sure that whatever happens next gets built on paperwork that's actually true, instead of a story you've been telling for a decade that conveniently forgot who held the controlling vote the entire time." "You could have told me any time in the last 10 years, he said, quieter now, something almost pleading in his voice, the earlier panic softening into something closer to genuine confusion. "Why now?" Why let it get this far all the way to a room full of people? Because you never asked me anything that would have required an honest answer, I said. You told me stories. You never once asked me a real question, not about the company, not about my mother, not about any of it. He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there, banquet hall lights still glowing behind him. Applause from his own toast barely faded from the room, and for the first time in 10 years, my former partner looked at me like someone he'd have to actually negotiate with, instead of quietly write out of the story. The deal eventually closed 3 months later on renegotiated terms that reflected my actual ownership stake, including a public correction to Ledgerly's founding story that Trevor, to his credit, didn't fight once his lawyers confirmed exactly how little room he had to maneuver. The acquiring company's press release, when it finally ran, listed both our names as co-founders for the first time in company history, a small correction that felt after 10 years both enormous and strangely anticlimactic, arriving not as a triumphant vindication, but simply as the truth finally catching up to where it should have been all along. I read the press release 3 times the morning it went live, sitting alone at my kitchen table, feeling less triumphant than I expected, and more simply quietly relieved. We haven't fully repaired our friendship, and I don't know if we will. Trevor called me a few weeks after the reunion, apologizing more fully than he had in the banquet hall, admitting that he'd genuinely convinced himself somewhere along the way that the story he told publicly had simply become the true one, the way people sometimes do when a comfortable version of events goes unchallenged, long enough that it starts to feel like memory instead of revision. I think I actually believed it, he said quietly, more honest than I'd heard him in years. That's the part that scares me most, looking back. I told him I appreciated the honesty and that I needed more time before I knew what, if anything, our relationship looked like going forward. He said he understood. I believed him more in that moment than I had in years. Some partnerships end the moment one person starts believing their own edited version of events, even if the paperwork takes another decade to catch up to the truth. I've thought about that a great deal since the reunion, how quietly, how gradually an entire shared history can get rewritten by one person's convenience. One comment at a time, until the person who actually lived it starts to wonder if she's misremembering her own life. What I've learned sitting with all of this is that being written out of your own story doesn't erase the parts of it that were legally permanently true the entire time. I didn't need to correct Trevor's toast in that banquet hall. The truth was already sitting in a drawer at my house, dated, signed, and waiting for exactly the moment it would matter most. Some vindications don't need volume. They just need to survive long enough to be true when it counts the same quiet patience that once made me insist on careful paperwork in a dorm room decades before. Either of us understood how much that single decision would eventually protect. If you've ever watched someone rewrite your contribution out of something you built together, tell me in the comments what finally set the record straight. A document, a phone call, a moment you'd waited years for without realizing it was coming. If this story hit home, share it with someone who's ever been quietly erased from their own success, and subscribe because there's another story like this one waiting for you next week.